Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. And in this episode, we are looking at where China could be headed over the next few years. Some of that has been articulated by China's leadership, like President Xi Jinping and his other top members of his establishment, which basically looks at China's attempt to steadily get to a position where it will be the most dominant nation in geopolitics. What is China going to do towards that? How does that concern big powers and China's big rival, the United States? How does it concern India? What is it that the Chinese can still contribute to the world? And what is it that the world should worry about China and its futuristic agenda? And we've got two experts, as always, who will help us understand China's geostrategic ambitions and its military mindset. We have Mr. Pramit Palchaudhuri, who is now an academic, but earlier a very well-read journalist on foreign affairs and understands America, China, and geopolitics rather well. And we've got General Sudhakar, who has served in the Military Operations Directorate, has commanded a division on the LAC, and is now, I believe, working on his PhD on issues related with China. So I'll start with you, Pramit. The US President, Joe Biden, has made a formal national security strategy identification in which China is seen as America's most consequential geopolitical challenge. This comes 21 months after Biden being in the seat of the President of the United States. And it's a national security vision, which at least Americans will all be in consensus with President Biden. But how does this vision contrast with the fact that the Chinese are increasingly also seen, even now, as a trade partner, if not a trade rival, by the bulk of the world?
So as you correctly said, the Biden administration has issued a national security document. What's interesting about it is that it reflects almost completely in its views on China exactly what the Trump administration produced in their national security document regarding China. So that indicates for me that there is a consensus that an extreme right-wing Republican government and a liberal, very liberal Democratic government, one after the other, have said exactly the same thing when it comes to China, that this is America's overriding strategic rival and its primary strategic threat. And as you correctly said, one of the biggest problems, however, for both countries, the US and China, is their economic dependency on each other. But you've seen the Americans recently pass the so-called CHIPS Act, a science technology act, and even a so-called Inflation Reduction Act. But large chunks of those acts are very clear. They are designed to decouple, reduce America's dependence on China for key strategic products. So chips, 5G equipment, and so on. Toys and so on, there may be a dependency, but they're not of strategic importance. The CHIPS Act is particularly striking, I thought, but it basically said that American companies that manufacture machines that which China can use to make chips will also basically be banned. Not only be banned, that even US citizens working in China to help manufacture chips would be disallowed from doing so and would be treated effectively as having committed a crime for doing so. So this literally takes or chops off China's chip capacity right at the knees, because China doesn't manufacture the bulk of its own chips. It uses Taiwanese, Japanese, or American technology to do so. And it's going to be very interesting because the Chinese have been looking at this likelihood that America was going to take them out on this front. But here, the CHIPS Act has now come into play. And you're literally seeing Americans working in these factories, executives basically saying, I'm resigning right now, I'm going home. I have to, because I'm going to be arrested otherwise if I don't go back. So you're seeing that the CHIPS Act is an enormous break. The step is going to be, I think, is going to be rare earths, as the Chinese dominate the processing of critical minerals. And I have a suspicion they will retaliate by saying that critical mineral supplies to the United States will effectively be chopped off or restricted. And America has already begun a process of trying to develop its own mining and other mining capacities. And notably, the Quad is a key component of this, because the Quad has working groups on all of these technologies plus more. So the technological war between the US and China is now very clear. And I think it's now going to spread into other areas, but it can't be done overnight. It's simply impossible. Both economies would suffer so dramatically. But the CHIPS Act, I think, is really a shot across the bow of China that America is serious, and we'll see a response from China on that front.
Quite clearly, I mean, their rivalry is going to go way beyond the Pacific Ocean and always makes the headlines about China and Taiwan in particular, and how China continues to be Russia's go-to option during the Ukraine conflict. But I'll come back to you after this on that. And General Sudhakar, on military security issues, the Chinese are stressing again and again on modernization. Their defense budget is already number 2 after the United States, but they're not willing to stop there. I mean, it's far in excess of India's defense budget, though China has brought upon itself many security challenges, which could be easily averted if China works out a compromise arrangement with a number of its adversaries on its borders. So where do you see the Chinese going as far as the control that the party will more and more exercise over the military? And the party's vision, I believe, goes beyond that of the military, because the party wants China to be supreme on all counts by 2050, 100 years of the Communist Party, whereas the military has to do the legwork on the ground. How do you see them working in sync?
Yeah, firstly, thank you for inviting me to your channel, and once again, compliments for bringing out very superlative products of global standard. Very pertinent question. And to respond to the question, let me start with what you have just said. The very objective of Xi Jinping when he came to power in the year 2012, through the difficult times, the Politburo was totally corrupted, and he had a task at hand to cleanse the system. He started with a bang, taking the blessing of all his predecessors and the superiors, and wherein he occupied a central stage of preeminence, I would say, in the constitution, in the teaching syllabus, in the school books, textbooks, as also the way of life. By and by, he also carried out a huge transformation of the armed forces. In the year 2015, the first formulated modernization white paper came out. Although it had been conceived way back in 2004, it was subsequently revised in the year 2019. So be that as it may, where does it take China to? Today, as we are talking, we should be all aware and be mindful of the fact that this modernization, which was conceived in the year 2004, which came out in black and white in 15 and thereafter revised in 2019, has taken a new dimension altogether. That new dimension is in keeping with the ultimate objective of the Middle Kingdom. They want to rejuvenate. Xi Jinping's ambitious plan is to rejuvenate the Middle Kingdom to the centrality of the earth. All of the civilizations are actually operating around that, be it the logistics or economics or strategy or any issue. Having said that, the land, air, and the sea or the water, these 3 important components of the armed forces, they have further been actually added with elements and components like space, cyber, electromagnetic. And when you come to the cyber domain, they are the experts. When you come to the space domain, it is further divided into the lower space and the upper space, in which China is making very significant headway, keeping US as the primary challenge with which they are competing, they are contesting, and sooner or later, they would be having, or they're at least aiming for a combat edge to match with the capability of the US as a superpower. Back to you, please.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I'm completely with you on this, because what we need to understand is the Chinese are working to a plan. And the fact that they have built in a threat at various levels, I would see that as an exercise in energizing their forces to work to the plan. Militaries across the world are best suitable to prepare for conflicts. And when a conflict scenario is thrust over a blueprint that has been built up, it just gets their military to get more enthusiastic about achieving national aims. But I'll come back after a break to look at two important issues. How would China look at both Taiwan and India as the two areas where China would certainly create global headlines with what it undertakes, apart from its internal initiatives? But that after a break. We are looking at what are the issues that will concern the world and India with China and its agenda over the next 5 years or maybe 10 years. And two or three things strike me as something that will be of concern. One is, of course, China's policies towards Taiwan, and to what extent they would consider the use of force, which President Xi Jinping in his opening address at the Congress did not rule out. But would China be willing to take on something like that, as Russia has taken on the intervention in Ukraine, and which in turn, to my mind, if you don't achieve quick success, can have a massive ricochet effect on the economy and everything else. So Pramit, where do you think the priorities will lie? Acquisition of Taiwan's land space, or the improvement of the lives of their people with a rejuvenation of their economic and public health and security agenda at home?
If you look at Xi Jinping's speech at the party Congress, he warns his people that we are going to be facing, I think it was high winds, choppy waters, and dangerous storms. And at the 20th Party Congress report, which is a voluminous report, the word security appears twice as more often than it did, for example, in the previous Party Congress. And the word strategic appears also almost 30% more often. Diplomacy is actually reduced. The word diplomacy makes a far less references. Taiwan and military, of course, have a slight increase. But I think what's noticeable, I think, is very clear that there is no clear idea of how to handle China's reducing economic growth rates. Everybody's looked at China. Every Chinese economist and expert of note has said that China has to move on, and the party itself had said earlier, move away from an investment-based growth pattern to one of consumption. Nothing of the sort has happened. If anything, Xi Jinping has doubled down on an investment-based growth model, which means the returns will slowly keep dropping off. It's almost like he doesn't actually care. He just assumes that a reduced economic growth rate is something that's acceptable in return for stronger and more centralized, consolidated party control of the economy. And the fact that he's turned on the private sector of China and argued against privatization, increasing state control of the economy in favor of all of that, all indicates that he's prepared to accept a lower growth rate, because it has been the private sector that has driven the economy over the past 25, 30 years. So on the economic front, he seems very clear that I'm going to go back, if anything, to a Maoist communist state structure and accept the losses economically that will entail. He's very clear, I think, also that the decoupling of whatever America may be doing to us, we're planning to do double. We will also basically isolate our economy from, this is not just at the party Congress, but previous statements and comments. So you're looking at a country that in many ways is building itself into a fortress. But the one thing that is definitely very consistent with him is that in many ways, what my biggest accomplishment as a leader in China, for all of these sacrifices on the economy and so on that I will push on you, is that I will reunify China. Now, how he does that is a good question. And one potential lesson that he may have drawn from the Ukraine war is that a direct military invasion is very risky. The Chinese concept of statecraft has always been that direct military conflict is a dangerous thing. You never know, there's an uncertainty factor. So Sun Tzu, but various others, the generals that the Chinese uphold as their greatest generals are the ones who win without actually. So for them, I think the subversion factor, this is what Russia was very successful in Europe and other places, I think is going to be played up. When I've spoken to the Japanese security system, for example, they said, we expect more in the form of economic, cyber, and non-conventional political subversion as being the primary instruments of Chinese action against Taiwan, because that's what they see as their strong point. Now, this doesn't mean they do rule out military action, but they're very clear on that publicly. But it would have to be, that would only really come into play when they have a clear indication that Taiwan is off its guard, it's weak, or America's commitment to Taiwan and security is for some reason in doubt.
Okay, that's very good, because that brings us to the issues that China has been considering for some time now, that the use of unrestricted warfare principles, which are essentially non-military, confrontational, non-kinetic, but more by using other resources to paralyze systems before they go in for the kill. But General Sudhakar, in the case of us confronting China, and 2 years after the incursions on the LAC, things haven't calmed down, talks or no talks, where do you see the Chinese position on the LAC or the boundary dispute looking any different in the years ahead?
Very interesting and relevant question. I must compliment you. As I look at the issue, to me, being an Indian Army officer, I do not see any future, any promise of the resolution of the boundary issue with China. China has openly, in public domain, you look at the blogs and the comments in any kind of internet communication today, they have openly declared India as an adversary. It is our magnanimity and our way of looking at things that we do not look at China. We still hope for the best, that yes, sooner or later, we'll be able to strike some kind of a compromise with China. But that is not going to move the way we anticipate. This is my assessment. Secondly, whatever may come about along the border, let's not ignore the issue. It is going to be driven by the core interest of China. What are the core interests of China today, as in today? I look at it, there are more number of internal instability issues, be it Xinjiang or be it Tibet or Inner Mongolia, or primarily if I see the inequality between a market economy and a planned economy is so much that Xi Jinping has to put in a major share of his time to consolidate first. whatever changes and transformations he's bringing about, it will be wise on his part, prudent on his part to have his feet on the ground and thereafter start doing what he has in his mind to rejuvenate the Middle Kingdom by 2049. This is one. Secondly, if you allow me, second point is only then that he is going to look towards what he has done in the recent past. 628 border villages along the Indo-China border. It has been completed totally with optical fibers, with the oil pipeline, with the communication network, with the power supply, with the permanency of a G695, which is about to come up by 2035, but in my assessment, it will be completed by 2028. This is going to change the character of the border altogether. What we have been trying to defend are old time-tested articulations from 1947 by our very first Prime Minister may become a kind of a mirage to actually secure. So therefore, it may be prudent to at least by the decision makers to sit down, be pragmatic in our approach and go in for resolving the issue by a method of give and take at the earliest, which will be beneficial for India to look at a 15 trillion or 30 trillion economy by 2050. And so as also give us way and space to enhance our credibility in the international stature. Back to you.
Very well brought out, Jan Saab. And I cannot agree with you more. And my views are on record in writing to say that you have to have a pragmatic approach to try to resolve your boundary issues with China on an as-is, where-is basis. But more of all that at a later date. Thanks for your brilliant inputs. And thank you to everybody for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.
You know,